on the ground. A plane that burns then crashes shows a different pattern than a plane that crashes then burns. A fire that ignites during flight generally burns hotter than a fire caused by impact because it's fanned by the rushing wind. According to Waldock, pre-impact fires leave a distinctive signature.
One of the things that we look for in considering pre-impact fire versus post-impact fire is evidence that metal was hot when it hit the ground. And right in this area of the engine compartment on the left side, you see a little bit of feathered aluminum. To get that aluminum to broom straw or feather, that metal has to be up near its melting point. And right here we see a little bit of evidence that that process has occurred. That tells us that we had a pre-impact fire in this left engine compartment.
Less than 7% of fires occur on impact. But when they do, they make the investigators' work much more difficult. When rescue crews put out the flames, the force of spraying water moves parts a considerable distance, and the fire itself can destroy valuable evidence.
Fire will tend to get rid of our physical evidence. We're looking for example, fatigue in a metal structure. If the airplane caught on fire when it hit the ground, it'll tend to erase that evidence, tend to burn it away. And fire is one of the worst things we can do.
At the crash site in Canada, fire was only the first of the many challenges investigators would face. Burn patterns showed that the fire was the result of the impact, not the cause of it. Lead investigator Roger Ayotte recalls the scene.
The aircraft had crashed some 1,500 feet away from the airport, and the actual crash site itself was not particularly large. The airplane had hit the ground at fairly high speed, and the destruction was considerable. It certainly wasn't evident when we went onto the accident site what the problem had been. When we did start examining the wreckage, we realized that the aircraft, in fact, had impacted the ground inverted because the engine positions were switched on the ground.
Ayotte and his team reasoned the fog may have played a role, but only a minor one. The pilots were too experienced, the collision too fast and furious, the devastation too complete. In the charred rubble, investigators located the flight's black boxes, still bolted to the tail. Their bright orange exteriors were camouflaged with soot. Perhaps the boxes would reveal what happened. They were flown to Transportation Safety Board headquarters in Ottawa for analysis. In the lab, black box expert Michael Poole and computer analyst Bob Hoyle were stunned by what they found. The flight data recorder should have been an electronic device that captured most of the plane's mechanical functions on magnetic tape or microchip. Instead, it was an unauthorized and antiquated model, invented in 1951. Its use had been prohibited in many countries. Rather than electronic circuitry, the box used a stylus to etch information onto a moving roll of foil.
Okay, the flight data recorder on this aircraft was an old design. It was a foil type recorder, which is a metal foil, which 5 parameters are inscribed on the foil. And of those 5, heading, which is a key parameter, was actually not functioning. So we in fact only had 4 parameters. And in contrast with today's modern aircraft, which have 500-600 parameters per second, obviously there's a very big difference here. So we had a very limited flight data recorder. The data on that recorder is also, the resolution is very poor, and it's extremely time-consuming to extract the information off of these foil type recorders.
In its time, the foil recorder was a technological advance because it could survive impact and fire. Now, its primitive workings threatened to cripple the investigation. To eke out some meaning from the foil scratchings, Hoyle scanned them into a computer. Perhaps modern technology would give its predecessor a helping hand. Hoyle was able to sharpen and focus the information from the coarse etchings enough to interpret them. The FDR showed that the plane flew an unwavering course into the trees at more than 200 miles per hour. But one mark indicated something strange, a sudden burst of speed just before the plane struck. The information was incomplete and contradictory. Why would a plane, in the midst of an aborted landing, suddenly plunge into the ground? Poole and his colleagues turned to the cockpit voice recorder for an explanation. They found only more contradictions. The pilot told the co-pilot they were going to abort the landing, go around and try again. On the tape, in the background, the engines roared to full power. That was consistent with a climb. But it wasn't consistent with the disturbing final exchange between the pilot and co-pilot. Transcripts indicate the co-pilot began to warn that the plane was losing altitude.
Descending. Okay. Descending.
Well, when we first listened to the voice recorder, it was quite perplexing because the crew had initiated a missed approach. They were starting to do a go-around. We could hear engine power coming up. They were asking for gear up. They were asking for flaps up. They were starting to climb out, and for some reason the airplane transitioned from a climb out to a descent and crashed very quickly. So this was quite puzzling, and that was really where we started to focus. Why was this airplane, which should have been able to fly out, shouldn't have been a big problem, transitioning from an ascent to a descent and hitting the ground?
The black boxes yielded only vague clues. They held none of the hard data Poole had come to expect from them. He relayed the bad news to fellow investigators. The gaps left by the primitive data recorder would have to be filled in manually. A team of nearly a dozen forensic aviation specialists would have to engage in hardcore, old-fashioned detective work. Fortunately, they had an arsenal of sophisticated tools to help them. The first step was to determine if the damaged engine was the cause of the crash or the result of it. For that, investigators depended on engineering services specialist John Garstang.
As part of the crash site investigation, we saw that the right engine was extensively damaged and disintegrated. In order to understand this damage, whether it occurred in flight or it occurred in the ground as a result of ground impact, we had to know how the aircraft broke up. That's where we used tree information together with the attitude that it hit the ground to determine the breakup sequence.
Garstang specializes in coaxing clues from places investigators can't go, like the tops of the trees. He mounted a stereoscopic camera on a helicopter and shot 3D photos of the damaged trees. He used these photos to determine the angle at which the plane struck the forest.
This is the crash site. The red dots are pieces of wreckage. The aircraft initially descended through the forest starting here. All the black dots are trees that have been damaged, most of which had been cut by the aircraft.
He then created a model showing the path of the plane as it plowed through the trees. It showed the plane was level as it clipped the treetops. Both engines must have been in place, keeping the plane balanced. The roll didn't occur until after it hit the trees. Garstang concluded the engines were attached on impact. Now he had to see if they were working properly. Erratic moves in the final flight path of the plane might hint at an engine problem. But because the FDR didn't have the data Garstang needed, he had to devise a clever way to reconstruct the plane's movements. He made a map showing the locations of witnesses when they heard the plane.
We used the location of witnesses on the ground, and through triangulating from where they are to where they either saw the aircraft or heard it, we were able to determine that the general flight path was in an arc like this that approached towards the airport in this direction, and then ultimately the plane crashed over here.
Witnesses determined the flight showed no sign of trouble, and they provided Garstang with other useful information.
Initially, we heard that the witnesses heard noises or sounds like a wowing change in pitch that made us wonder whether there was possibly an engine problem or a propeller problem. And at the crash site, we were missing pieces, and there's an extensive damage done to the right engine that initially led us to try and focus in that area to see if that was an area of concern.
Engine trouble is often the cause of small plane crashes. To see if it was behind this accident, Chief Analyst Bill Taylor dissected the battered engines.
When we're doing an engine investigation and doing a teardown, there are 2 or 3 things that we're looking for. First of all, we want to see whether there's been a mechanical failure in the engine. That's most apparent, most obvious, and the easiest thing to do. The second is to look for evidence of the power level. That's very helpful in an accident investigation to discover whether the engine was producing full power. It may be running, but running at low level, at idle, as you might say. It gives an indication, again, of what was available to the crew at that time.
If the engine was at full power when it crashed, it would bear the scars of its moving parts as they struck the engine body. Deep markings indicated the engines were at high power. The large amount of dirt and debris sucked into it on impact confirmed that finding. Taylor gave the engines a clean bill of health. He determined the wowing sounds heard by witnesses were normal engine sounds bouncing off the uneven terrain. He'd have to look elsewhere for answers. He checked the landing gear. It too was working. It was nearly retracted at the time of the crash, consistent with the procedure for an aborted landing. So far, the plane seemed in perfect working order. No clues had surfaced. Investigators were stymied. But was it possible something was driving the pilot to land quickly and take risks? Could he have been running out of fuel? John Garstang used infrared photography to find out.
What we have here on the left is a conventional color photograph of the forest, and on the right is what's referred to as a near-infrared photograph.
In conventional photography, fuel blends into the natural shadow. But shot with near-infrared film, the spray of fuel appears as a dark stain.
Records like the weight and balance gave us a good indication of what the fuel quantity should be, and we used the infrared imagery to confirm that there was sufficient quantity or a large quantity of fuel present. We have the ground scar here left by the right wing, and you can see a general area of discoloration where the fuel has been sprayed, as well as there's been a ground fire and branches have been broken.
The photographs revealed the plane arrived at the airport with fuel to spare. Another dead end for the investigators. According to all indications, Flight 70 should never have crashed. But it did. And until investigators figured out why, the tragedy could recur. The nagging question remained. After aborting the landing, why would the pilot start to climb and then dive into the earth? Engineer Jim Foots checked the accuracy of the aircraft's instruments. Perhaps they were lying.
Well, we look at the instruments, and which leads to looking at the dial faces and in the internal mechanisms of the instruments, because again, not all FDRs record all parameters. So we can look at the instruments and at times get information from the dial face, such as pointer slaps, gear train damage, and they will tell us what that actual system was doing at impact.
If the impact was severe enough, the pointer would slap against the dial face and leave a mark. Even if the pointer was lost, the telltale mark would remain. Most of the instruments were destroyed beyond recognition. Only the altimeter survived, and it showed the plane's altitude setting was right where it should have been. The pilot should have known how close to the ground he was. Once again, the solution remained elusive. But Foots had his suspicions. If the plane was going down, a warning system should have alerted the pilot. unless the warning system itself was faulty. He directed his attention to the warning lights. Light bulb filaments can tell a great deal about conditions at the moment a plane crashes.
Well, we do light bulb analysis even if the aircraft does have an FDR or CVR. If the FDR gives us an indication that there was a problem, a warning, then we can look at the light bulbs and actually say, yeah, this light was on, and that the pilot did have a warning or a caution light.
A bulb that's lit when it's broken reacts very differently than a bulb that's off. It's easy for the trained eye to spot the difference.
What we're looking at here is the filaments. And what we look for with the filaments is deformation, as you see here, total uncoiling of the filament, which is indicative of a hot or illuminated filament when impacted, as opposed to a lamp that was off or cold at impact, where we have just a straight brittle fracture.
Foots found that none of the 37 surviving warning bulbs from Flight 70 had been on. But that didn't necessarily mean all was well with the craft. Still searching for clues, investigators focused again on the position of the aircraft. While attempting to abort the landing, perhaps the plane's nose tilted too high. At a steep angle, air can't glide easily over the wings. The plane stalls and drops from the sky. In order to figure out if Flight 70 stalled, investigators would have to climb into the pilot's seat. Whatever happened to Skylink Flight 70 came without warning. Now investigators had to reconstruct the tragedy. The stall avoidance system on this type of aircraft was notoriously unforgiving. It provided very little notice to the pilot before a stall. At low altitude, the difference between stall and crash and life and death is mere seconds. To see if the plane's pitch or angle in the air would cause a stall, investigators needed to reconstruct its final moments. For that, they needed a flight simulator. They fed in all the data they collected, along with pilot commands from the voice recorder. The simulator would combine these disconnected clues into a close estimate of the plane's position.
We knew what the altitude and airspeed of the aircraft was at the start of the missed approach. We also knew when they added the power, when they retracted the landing gear, and when they retracted the flaps. So we were able to come into the simulator and use those parameters that were available off the flight data recorder and fly the airplane in accordance with those parameters, and then through that process determine what the pitch attitude of the aircraft was.
If the pitch was too steep, the plane would have stalled, then crashed. But that wasn't what happened. The simulator showed the plane's pitch was fine. Stalling and a faulty stall avoidance system were ruled out. After a tireless examination of the plane from nose to tail, investigators could finally rule out mechanical failure. They had only one more place to find answers, with the man in the cockpit. To determine if human error was at fault, Roger Ayotte needed to get inside the pilot's head.
Once we had eliminated the possibility of mechanical malfunction of the aircraft, and that was probably a couple of months into the investigation, then we were able to focus all of our efforts on the operational and human performance sides of the accident.
While one type of investigator searches for physical clues, another looks for psychological ones. Black box expert Mike Poole created a voice print, turning emotion into a picture. And human performance investigators Ron Coleman and Beth McCullough were brought in to study it. To explore what was going on in the minds of the pilots, they scrutinized their final words.
Descending. Okay. Descending.
So his first response
First one's casual.
is,
Yes.
okay, no big deal, but
The second one's got a lot of anxiety in it.
When the co-pilot alerted the pilot they were descending, The pilot answered calmly with a simple "okay." McCullough felt there was far more going on than the first playback led them to believe.
But if you've got someone next to you who's obviously expressing concern and in a rather agitated voice, then you begin to wonder, and that might be your first question, is this captain being really calm about the situation, has it fully under control, or is he unaware of the gravity of the situation?
Descending. Okay. Descending.
First thing that we picked up was the anxiety in the co-pilot's voice when he uttered the second descending. After that, we went back, listened to the entire tape many, many times to try and determine the various operational issues that might have emerged or did emerge, and also some of the human performance issues that were clear just from listening to the voices and the pauses and the hesitation.
From the voice recording, Coleman and McCullough surmised that the pilot sounded unconcerned, oblivious to the fact that he was speeding towards certain death. They ruled out suicide. Psychological profiles were normal. The investigation team suspected the pilot was literally lost in the clouds. He didn't know which way was up. And he wasn't trusting his instruments or his co-pilot to set him straight. Did pilot error cause the crash? The team was close to figuring it out. But before they could, more testing was necessary. Was the pilot of Flight 70 truly disoriented in the fog? To illustrate what he might have experienced, Mike Poole collated the data and produced an animated version of the fatal flight. Next to it, he created an illusion plane. It was based on what the human performance experts believe the pilot may have perceived.
Columnist approach, he asks for the gear to come up, the gear is selected up, he calls for the flaps to come up, and the first officer has responded with flaps coming up to half.
Shrouded by fog, unable to see the runway, the pilot searches for visual clues outside his window. In his efforts to get his bearings, he fails to notice his gauges or to heed his co-pilot's concern.
What we know, and from our operational investigators suspect, that he is maybe adjusting the throttles in the cockpit, he's maybe unfamiliar with his flight director, he's in fog, he's perhaps a little bit lost in respect to where exactly is the runway, is it to my right, is it to my left? So all these factors can be distracting him from that task of watching those instruments.
The animation showed that the pilot did indeed confuse up with down. The condition is called somatographic illusion. It occurs when pilots are deprived of visual cues. Instead, they rely on gut instinct.
Basically, the human body cannot distinguish the difference between a force through your stomach pushing against the back of your chair due to thrust, due to being accelerated down a runway, for example, or the same force due to pitching you up and feeling the effects of gravity pushing you back in the chair.
Though the pilot may have been operating under an illusion, the consequences of his actions were dreadfully real. Investigators went back to the simulator to experience for themselves Flight 70's fatal illusion. A simulator is an excellent place to perform a test for illusions because it's a machine that's been built to trick the eye and mind.
In a simulator, you're in a building, and obviously it can't accelerate you down a runway. But it wants to make you feel that. So to achieve that, what they do is they tilt you back in your chair and you feel the force of gravity in your chair, and then they fool your visual senses by taking the horizon. Instead of you would normally see it rise, they actually keep it level. So your eyes think the horizon's level, you're feeling this force through your stomach into the back of the chair. That is the sensation of accelerating down the runway, and that essentially is the somatographic illusion.
Roger Ayotte took the mock fatal flight. All the data were entered and the horizon taken away so he could feel the sensation as the pilot had. But he'd fly under instrument flight rules, or IFR, relying totally on his gauges so he would know where the plane was relative to the ground.
Okay, and this is the same approach being conducted in IFR conditions. So you have to concentrate totally on your instruments, and as you can see, you have no visual references outside the cockpit.
With his view blocked, he couldn't tell if he was going up or down while accelerating. but the gauges told him he was heading toward the ground. The simulated flight proved that the pilot had fallen victim to the illusion.
You can fly by the seat of your pants to a certain extent when you're in visual flight conditions, and that is done frequently. However, when you're in instrument flight conditions, so when you're flying in fog or cloud or something like that, then you don't have those visual senses that you do when you're flying visually.
The forces of motion in 3 dimensions can play tricks on the mind. The inner ear regulates balance and lets us know where we stand, but it needs a visual reference. It's extremely difficult to overpower the human instinct to rely on vision when flying. But through sheer willpower, a pilot can stay true to the instruments until his mind overcomes his body. Unfortunately, the pilot of Flight 70 wasn't aware of the danger. It takes a network of complex systems to keep a plane in the air. It also takes a tangle of circumstances to send one crashing down. In both Roselawn, Indiana, and Terrace, British Columbia, a combination of factors conspired against the aircraft, dooming the passengers and crew. But aboard the planes were the black boxes. These indestructible witnesses, coupled with human ingenuity, determined what went wrong. By surviving a crash, black boxes enable us to prevent